Hello, thanks for coming. My name is Jeff Yaksik. I'm a UX designer on the Android project. And for Android, we needed to do a open source font. And there wasn't very many nice ones that had like a complete international character set. So we hired a company called Acenter Corporation. And I had the privilege to work with Steve MATTESON on the font. And he's the principal designer. And other notable fonts he's worked on include Segoe for Microsoft Windows and Convection for Xbox 360. And he did Droid for Android. Anyway, I'll let him tell you the rest. His name is Steve MATTESON.
Hello. Thanks for coming out, and thanks for the opportunity, Jeff, to give this presentation. I first gave this talk as a case study specifically on the convection fonts we did for the Xbox, but it's since sort of grown a life of its own as I've talked to AIGA and some other corporations, talking to professionals and students, and sort of helping them understand why type is relevant and how it can be a tool, and it kind of dispels some of the misinformation about fonts, and most people take fonts for granted, so it's kind of a good practical discussion about type design. So I try to cover three fundamental areas in no real particular order. Why fonts are important and why we spend so much time trying to get them right. A little bit about type design and the kind of the process that goes on behind type design, and then I talk a little bit about Android at the very end. And along the way, there's some common issues that we face designing fonts specifically for devices. So it's no secret that type and fonts are often taken for granted and don't really become a topic of interest until something goes wrong. And so here's an example, but here's an example that might really have happened. I think that was probably just something somebody photoshopped. But this is an actual problem that's at a mall near my home in Boulder, Colorado. And there's about 8 of these signs, and every one is wrong just a little bit differently from the other. And if anybody can shout out what they think is wrong with this sign. Beautiful, beautiful. A very educated crowd here. I can see. If we zoom in a little closer, we can see the O is pretty sloppy looking. And every one of these signs is rotated just a little bit differently, and I wondered if it would kill them to look at the artwork to see exactly how to rotate it. And so thanks to Photoshop, I can rest at ease and fix it myself. It's rotated in that way because of the typeface Lydian, which it's based on, was drawn with a broad nib pen. And of course, the pen is held at about a 30-degree angle, and that kind of gives you that sort of egg-shaped inside of the O. So now you know what it is that keeps type designers awake at night. I was at the Consumer Electronics Show, and I saw this booth. This logo looked pretty ugly to begin with, but there's some specific type things that are wrong, and if anyone could shout out what they see wrong. The V's are flipped, exactly, and how about the S actually looks upside down. So someone's just getting a little bit too clever there, or it was a mistake from whoever laid out the the piece that makes that podium there. So Jan Tschichold said that everything that counts in typography is a subtlety, and so this talk is why type experts are called on to refine and build type systems for brand identities, user interfaces, publications, and whatnot. And typically, type folks like myself don't get out too much, so I'm going to do a quick introduction of myself and my company here. I got sucked into this esoteric world of type design at Rochester Institute of Technology in the mid-'80s at the School of Printing there. And I was surrounded by the most advanced web presses and typesetting systems of the era, but I was much more enamored with the old letterpress. And dusty drawers of type and very tactile experience. And I also experienced quite a bit of their personal collection of rare books and manuscripts. And there were two professors there that sort of held out against all the technology that was coming in, and they tried to preserve the tradition. And like this 15th century book of hours, all hand-lettered, of course, and hand-illuminated with gold leaf. You really can't get that kind of color on a plotter or an inkjet printer. And here's Horace's works, printed by Aldous Manutius. The type is all hand set, and the illumination is added afterwards, sort of in tradition with the way the manuscripts were made. And then in the 1700s, Fournier printed this manual of typography using actual pieces of type to make these ornaments. So it was all printed at the same time. It was sort of like the big revolution in being able to print the graphics and the text together at the same time. So being able to experience these works of art really humbled me, and they left an indelible impression on me as I tried to reproduce books in the same manner with handset type and hand illumination. The other thing that RIT had was one of the country's first Mac labs. And so I divided half my time between pushing Bezier curves around Adobe Illustrator, and then the other half of my time had hand-setting lead type. And that experience with type and the Macintosh landed me my first job editing bitmaps. Bitmaps are sort of the digital equivalent of individual pieces of metal type. And they work at one size. They're designed and tuned for one size only. But it was a good way to begin. My next job, I was introduced to outline types, and this was a technology that predated TrueType. These fonts will scale to any size, but below 18 point on a screen, for instance, they start to fall apart, and they need a little engineering help to look good. So what we did was write what we call hints to preserve the typographic features when the fonts are scaled for screen sizes. And real quick, what hinting does is if you have a unhinted font and you lay it onto the pixel grid of any device, you get this random pattern, like at next to the blue triangle, you have uneven stem weights, very jagged curves, and hinting actually helps. You see next to the green triangle, hinting helps preserve the weight proportions and some of the curves. And then TrueType came along next to the pink triangle there and gave you the ability to get bitmap quality with this scalable type. So you could actually, it was just like bitmap editing. You could turn pixels on and off for individual sizes. And so after a couple years doing this, I got called on to work with Monotype Typography on their first TrueType fonts that shipped with Microsoft Windows 3.1. And Windows didn't look too pretty, and it crashed a lot. But at least it had scalable fonts. This is the first time hundreds of millions of people are now able to set type on a screen and see what it looks like before it actually comes out of the printer. It was a pretty revolutionary thing at the time. So I went on to hint dozens of fonts for Monotype. And hinting requires a great deal of analysis of letter forms. You really have to go in and break down features and design elements and then write code so that these elements hold up at small sizes. It proved to be a really good training ground for type design itself. So I started experimenting with type design. And I got this letter from a friend of mine from like third grade, fourth grade. And I'd always admired his handwriting. And I got this letter from him, and I was learning how to do type design. So I did what any self-respecting type designer would do. I digitized it. And I wrote him a letter back about 2 weeks later in his own handwriting. And we get a kick out of this now because when we both became parents, we noticed that Pampers uses this as one of their corporate typefaces. So every time we change a diaper, well, there it is, you know. So at Monotype, I designed several typefaces and revived a lot of old hot metal typefaces that hadn't been made into digital typefaces yet. Truesdell is an example of a face that was designed by Fred Gowdy in the 30s. And he cast 2 sets of metal type, and then his studio burned down, and the matrices that they used to make the type all melted. So essentially he didn't have a backup. So there were two fonts cast, a 14-point type, and one of them was at RIT. So I went back there, pulled a proof, and digitized it and released it in 1992. And the other typefaces, Gaudi, Ornate, and Facade, were digitized from specimen books, just making really good scans of them and digitizing. I also did several typefaces which were custom for specific customers. Andale Mano was, in fact, designed for the user interface font for a Apple-IBM joint venture that many of you might be old enough to remember, called Taligent. And the company flopped, of course, so that whole idea, I guess, didn't make it. So, but since then, Andale Mano has found its way into tax software programs, terminal emulation programs, and it even ships with OS 10 now. And curls I like to refer to as my, probably my worst youthful indiscretion. Microsoft Publisher, as you know, it's not really a high-end publisher. Publisher isn't a very high-end publishing application, but they wanted something curly for their announcements. So yeah, so we made curls. Curly enough for you. I also learned a lot about non-Latin type design. This specifically shows the Arabic, Hebrew, and Thai that I did for Arial Unicode. There was a lot of learning going on in the last 20 years about type design and how these type forms work and how they relate to the Latin. In 2004, I left Monotype with a few of my closest colleagues to start a new font company called Ascender. And this is us in our San Francisco attire in 2004. And Ascender's business is basically divided in a few categories, the first of which is a website that we developed for consumer users of type. These are people who don't know font names, they don't know font designers, they just know they've got an invitation to make or they've got a flyer to make and they have no idea where to begin. But they know that the typefaces on their computer probably aren't quite right, they want something different. So they come here with a project or a problem that they want to solve. The other thing we do is OEM and ISV font licensing. And finally, the other biggest part of our business is custom design. And this is Seago, which I designed for Windows Vista. While I was at Monotype, but now since Ascender is keeping the fonts and extending them to include Greek, Cyrillic, Thai, Hebrew, and Arabic. So very large project. A much smaller project here is if you wear contacts, you probably use their eye drops, Alcon Labs. They came to us for a custom type family of 8 typefaces, so much smaller in scope than Seago. And then an even smaller example was this alphabet and figures I did for Motorola's current, at least I think they're shipping now, the newest handsets are using this typeface that I designed. So that's sort of me in Ascender in a nutshell. This is part 2 where we start talking about the most frequently asked question of people that have anything to do with the type business. Why is it we need more fonts? Now, a lot of people will answer the question by saying it's just like music or writing. It's a creative process that needs to be ongoing. For me, I'm a very practical person by nature, and so I kind of need a little more substance than that. So I break it into 3 categories. The first being we need more fonts because we need to fix the sins of the past. Most of the big companies had digital libraries, digital font libraries prior to PostScript and TrueType. When PostScript became the norm, all the companies, AGFA, CompuGraphic, Monotype, Berthold, URW, all the major foundries wanted to rush their entire libraries as quickly as they could to be the biggest and best PostScript libraries. And in so doing, they did these automatic conversions, which, for one thing, curves can tend to get kind of lumpy and details can get distorted. Another thing is a lot of people left kerning out. They just didn't bother putting kerning in the fonts. Character sets were often incomplete. And so now that we're moving on to the age of OpenType, we have a chance to revisit a lot of these fonts and put them right. And one example of this would be Linotype, for instance, has a series of fonts they call Next, like Frutiger Next and Avenir Next. It's kind of a fancy marketing way of saying we didn't get it right the first time. So here's our opportunity to fix that. Another reason for more fonts is the globalization of the economy. The European Economic Commission passed a ruling that said that if you're going to ship products inside of Europe, you need to support Greek and Cyrillic, Czechoslovakian, and some other character sets that were not in the basic Latin 1 character set. Semantic is an example of a font that a family of fonts that was given to me to add these languages to support. And I believe there was 12 fonts total in the Semantic project. Now, the third answer to the question of why more fonts is sort of probably the most important. It has to do with the simple fact that type is a communication tool. And just like the wrong size hammer can accomplish or completely ruin a job, typefaces, if it's the wrong choice, can hinder the message. Now, if you typeset a wedding invitation and you do some basic formatting, you think you're through, right? I mean, there's really, the message is all there. But suppose the user decides, maybe this is a little bit too bland for the big day. Let me see what I have in my fonts menu for something a little, oh, no. No, that's not right. There we go. There we go. That's more like it. It's, not many people had to stop and think why that last one was inappropriate. But it's sort of a knee-jerk response. You didn't have to sit there and analyze it and say, no, that's too drippy. That's not right. So, so it's because there's an underlying graphic message in type that goes along with the words. Just like this looks like an invitation or maybe a suggestion to stop, this looks authoritative and carries some warning about it. So the reason we need to do fonts right is either by creating new ones or by fixing the old ones is to accurately convey the written word. The renowned graphic educator Emil Reuter said it best: type gives form to language. We whisper, scream, inform, entertain, or in my case I gag now, or we inspire with our work. When a type designer gets handed the task of designing a typeface which speaks for a product or a corporation, we have to find the right voice or intonation which accurately represents the client. The type can form a glue which holds all the brand elements together, whether it's hardware design, taglines, colors, product names, what have you. And this is something that Nokia really understood when they embarked on their corporate type program. They knew that the fonts on the phone are now going to be carried around with you wherever you go. The brand is in your pocket. They look up and it's on the billboard. They look on the website, it's there. It's in the user manual. It's everywhere. It's something that I don't really understand about Apple. They have sort of a font war going on through their whole program. The iPhone is exclusively Helvetica. Here on their website, they have Myriad in the marketing pieces, but Lucida Grande for all the menu bars. The iPod has Myriad, and the website has Lucida Grande in the user interface. In iTunes, they have Helvetica and Lucida Grande. It's really doesn't seem like there's much of an excuse for a company to have such a strong sense of brand and design to have this this mosh pit of typefaces. So in 2000, I was asked to develop typefaces for the original Xbox product, and they understood that they wanted the brand to tie in with the user interface. I was told in no uncertain terms that the Xbox should be completely disassociated from corporate Microsoft. It had to be angular and edgy and futuristic, so categorically different from a typical office software company. And I thought I knew what they were getting at, because I played video games when I was little, and some of this too. And things have come a long way in gaming, obviously, but the essentials really haven't changed much. Particularly, the demographic was still well over 85% male at the time. So I went back to my studio and I started drawing some grids. And one of them was like this. I had rounded corners and kind of this sort of very blocky presence. it was really the easiest project I ever did. I just sort of connected the dots and rounded the corners. The rounded corners actually helped give it sort of this glowing look rather than these harshly defined edges. And the creative group liked it, so I filled out the character set. And it became pretty clear to me that as a type designer, this presented some unique legibility challenges. You certainly don't want the user to have to look twice at their score and then miss their shield button and then get terminated by their opponent. So you have to make sure that the B and the 8 are distinguishable and the 5 and the S and that sort of a thing. So I had to be a little clever on some of the characters. And they liked it so much, but they also wanted another typeface that was sort of more readable in text, but they still wanted this real angular, edgy look to it. So I went back to one of the grids I was working with, one of the previous ones, and I made this sort of a text face, which it's hard to call it a text face really, but it's certainly easier to read than the all caps version. And so they wanted it to use in marketing, and then they ended up using it in the user interface as well to help set the hierarchy within the UI. And I was unable to see any of this until the product shipped. So I had to take their word for it that all this stuff was looking okay. Letter spacing, proportions, X height, all these little details that type designers have to think about. I was just sort of flying blind and guessing, using basically my intuition to guide me. And I think it worked out pretty well. And looking at it this way, you can sort of see that they're equally aggressive. It's a very literal sort of marriage of the industrial design and the type design. So the project ships, and they shipped something like 2 million in Japan alone, and they considered that was a little disappointing. And they figured that in order to really be successful, they had to appeal to the Japanese market. In fact, one of the VPs at Microsoft said that the product was so aggressive and large that they couldn't get it through the door of some apartments in Japan. So that was one of their reasonings. Now, from my own standpoint, I thought this really overtly aggressive-looking box probably didn't belong in everyone's living room. Not everyone wants this kind of stuff in their home, and Microsoft's consultants told them that they needed to cross over into other markets, especially the female demographic. And to me, it was sort of like, in musical terms, this sort of crossover, there's really not a whole lot of middle ground. So the new Xbox console was intended, the 360 tips you off that it's supposed to be around for everybody, sort of the well-rounded sort of thing. Plug in your home theater and any other accessories, and you have the home entertainment center for the family home. It appeals to the father, son, mother, and daughter. And the device really needed more than just a facelift to appeal to such a wide audience. And so I went to Microsoft and met with their designers and kind of got an understanding of what they were thinking of. This was in 2004. They had consulted about a dozen design firms and consultants around the world to get a pulse on what people really wanted. And the consultants put together this sort of pair of axes, which was supposed to help them pinpoint where they were and where they needed to be. And where they were was up in the upper left by the Hummer. It was a very wild industrial piece of hardware. Everything about it, the user interface, everything was very up in the upper left. Where they needed to be was the Porsche 911 Carrera. So to help visualize this for the talk that I originally put this together for, I put together some pictures. And when I put this together, I got to thinking, and the importance of the female demographic. I was thinking, why didn't they try to use something that maybe females could relate to a little better? So I tried this. I don't mean to be biased here. My wife, I know, says this is easier for her to figure, but she says those shoes in the lower right should have about a half-inch more heel. And I just said that's why I do type and not shoes. So they had the Hummer, and they needed to be more like the Porsche 911 Carrera, and which came out in 1963 and has retained this unmistakable styling since then. And it seemed to me pretty ambitious to have all this wrapped up in one consumer electronics device, but there you have it. So here's an example of some controllers that they were trying out. It's a terrible slide, but I apologize. But they're taking these industrial designs and placing them on the axes to figure out which fits their need. That's the development of the actual hardware device was all behind the scenes, and I couldn't see anything about what she was talking about, the art director, Shelley. So she gave me a couple slides of some things that were something to help inspire me. And one was this projector, and one is this speaker system. And then she gave me 3 typefaces that they'd been using in mock-ups. And each one of these had some of the characteristics, but not all of them for what they were looking for. I was pretty glad of that because I didn't think any of these really stood the timeless test very well. And they look kind of awkward to me, kind of like, to go back to the car analogy, I saw one of these in the Google parking lot, actually. So to go back to the typefaces again, to evaluate these specifically, the top is a typeface called Mr. Giacomo. Very condensed, although the W is really, really wide. The R is really, really wide. The E looks like it's from a completely different typeface. The fit is kind of weird. The right side of the K is really loose compared to the left. All these things about it were troubling. Distilla, the typeface in the middle, no space between letters. The A and the E look like they could be different alphabets, and the W, again, is really, really wide. And Chola, the bottom one, is the most refined, well-made typeface, but to me it looks more like the previous Xbox than what they were trying to achieve. So I went back to my studio and started thinking about typefaces and this whole idea of curvature and organic, and I started sketching some designs. This in particular was a typeface where I was trying to incorporate curvature at every opportunity and still have it be a text face. And very rough sketches that I digitized and got the system working in this slide here. Took some test letters, made bold weights, and put together a proposal to send back to them just to show that I was interested in the project. And they said, yeah, this is really nice, but what else have you got? So they gave me another week to work out some other ideas. And the first idea was looking at Half Dome. Since the first time I saw it, I knew there had to be a typeface in there somewhere. Had this really cool, smooth, glaciated surface, and then these rocky crags. I looked at a lot of different pictures of Half Dome, and I finally figured out where or how I could sort of show a typeface in this feature. So looking at the insides of these characters, you'll see there's this sort of a facet where the gentle curve all of a sudden drops off, and some larger sketches here, and some digitized characters, the first ones I did, to sort of get this notion, and made a bold weight so that they could, see the contrast and sort of the possibilities that this design system would have in my proposal. And now thinking about this shoe analogy, I look at this and I kind of think maybe it's a little too hiking boot. But I had moved on to another idea, which was sort of looking at a more contemporary style. I reduced the round corners to something more a tighter radius, so that making more rectangular but not completely rectangular. I wanted to retain an organic bit to it. So if you look at the letter C, the entry stroke has a different shape than the exit stroke. A lot of typefaces of this genre are just sort of bits and pieces of typefaces rotated, or of letters rotated into position, and that's that. So it's very mechanical looking. And I was trying to get away from that with this typeface, which became convection. And they liked it enough that we won the account, and again, they're looking at it on a piece of hardware on a HD TV somewhere in Redmond, and I had no idea what it really looked like to them. So they said, it's a little too light. Can you make a little darker for me? So I made a couple iterations of a little bit darker typeface, so to give it a little more presence in the UI. And they finally chose the one by the green there, the green triangle. And this is how the family was shaping up: the original proposal on top, the user interface version, and then 2 boulder weights for their branding group. And of course, as I said earlier, a global product needs global language support. Now, Greek is always a really interesting problem. You have a very scribal-rooted lowercase. The caps, of course, are very Latin, but the lowercase is very scribal, very fluid. And compared to the Latin, it's extremely different compared to the very constructed Latin lowercase. And Times, of course, is a very traditional Greek. However, Arial is sort of an overly Latinized. All the fluidity is gone. It's trying too hard to be like the Latin Arial. So the approach to convection was to preserve some of the fluidity of the historical Greek model, yet simplify it so that it went well with the Latin design concept. And here's sort of showing the larger character set of what was finally approved by the linguistic type experts at Microsoft. Cyrillic has the complete opposite problem of Greek. It's very rectangular, very boxy. So incorporating curve wherever you can helps legibility, but if you add too much, it doesn't look like Cyrillic anymore, or it looks forced. And in this case, I had a lot of compromise to make because convection is very rectangular, and in order to read this well on the screen, I had to make sure there was enough curvature in it. Russian words are very long, so that it sort of enhances that whole notion of boxiness. So if you look at text, this is Latin, Greek, and Cyrillic all in one block. You'd probably never see this, but if you blur your eyes, you can see where the Greek jumps out as being very round. The Cyrillic is very rectangular and horizontal, and the Latin is somewhere in between. So it's kind of an interesting exercise to see how the various scripts go together. Now finally, after 4 months of intensive type development, and about 16 months later, we got to see what it looked like together with the product. And I understand that they feel very, very good about this because there were people speculating that either Apple or Sony helped them out with their product design. So they were pleased with the results. Now the user interface is interesting. They keep this kind of notion of subtle curvature. And then I read that in the original Xbox, there was something like 45 user interface screens for the entire product. With the Xbox 360, there's about 450 user interface screens. And to me, that says that type on the screen, type on the device is becoming a lot more important, not less. And some people are arguing that it's all about icons and all this, but the type itself, there's 10 times more reading to do on the new Xbox than there was on the old. And so we somehow acquired a point-of-purchase display of the Xbox product, and it actually was fun to be able to look at the actual screen and see how the typeface was performing in the environment. If you the convection design has some very subtle curvatures in it, and looking at it in this resolution on an HD monitor to see if those subtle curvatures are really holding up. If you zoom in really close, you can see that every letter looks a little bit different depending on where it is on the screen. If you look at particularly the 4 Ds in the lower right, every one of them is slightly different. And none of them really look all that good either. This is all about the renderer, how the fonts are rendered on the Xbox device. It's a process that's, of course, proprietary, but they super sample the type, but it's unhinted. And what I talked about earlier about hinting, about the sort of randomization of how the letters end up looking is what you're seeing here. I looked at the keypad and I noticed that the number 5 had grown a serif on the bar from my original design. Lots of little artifacts come up. Here on the cap E and enter, you can see these little bulbs at the end of the strokes. Now that's not something that occurs in every uppercase E, so it's not like I could design it with a little taper, so that those pixels would be less intense at the end. So it's a really hard thing to nail down. In general, if you look at it, I'm circling the A's there. You can see that my design of kind of a rounded bottom of the A is still holding up. So sort of the essence of the type is still preserved, even though there's some of these weird artifacts that show up. This is a mock-up of the typeface, or the game Call of Duty, and it's using the typeface Georgia. So I kind of laid it out the way it looks in the game Call of Duty, because this beautifully constructed typeface, when you put it into a user interface, becomes a glowing shadow of its former self. It just shows you that you can't just drop any old typeface into a user interface and expect it to work out. Look at the lowercase a, I'll toggle back. The lowercase a in layout becomes very, very skinny. And the serifs on the cap S, particularly if you look down at the word southpaw, they just get these enormous glowing pixel patterns. And this is one of the things that the Android team understood very well, and one of the reasons why they wanted to have ownership of the font data so that they could tool it specifically for devices if, to this level. The very same font data can look very different depending on the rendering environment. Here's Times New Roman, the top screen, high resolution. Then you have black and white rendering, monochrome. But then those two examples at the bottom are different forms of anti-aliasing. One's XP and the bottom one is free type, which is what Android uses. And you can see that the results with the same exact font data are very, very different. And if any of you play around with Photoshop, you're probably very familiar with these 5 settings of text rendering that are possible. Each gives you a very different look. Each gives you a very subtle difference, but if you look from between the top and the bottom, it's a pretty extreme difference in how the type is rendering. And in fact, with the Zune media player that we worked on for Microsoft, there were instances, if you look at the middle line, the crisp setting, there's instances where there's little widow pixels sticking above and below the baseline. You can barely see it probably on the projection, but on the Zune device, with white text reversed out of a dark background, those little pixels really pop out, and they can really be distracting. I'm not sure why they call it crisp, because it looks uncrisp to me. It actually looks like it's got more spread. But so this is another thing that Android recognized, was the fact that the renderer and the type is very important to have ownership of. So a couple slides here about Android. When we developed the fonts, Jeff and I discussed very much about sort of the scope of typefaces. We want to be, there's this range of cute to techno, and neutral right in the middle. We knew we couldn't be too far left or right, and neutral was a little bit too boring. So we had to find a sweet spot in there somewhere. And the first typeface I did was a kind of a bouncy design. Lots of angled stress, kind of referring to Cattoll, the typeface that the Google logo is in. The idea was to be sort of cute but not cuddly. Let's be friendly. And we tried a couple tests. Here's that typeface. In fact, if you look at this, you can see there's a lot going on, and probably way too much going on for a user interface design. There's a lot of angled shapes in there. The cat P has an open bowl. So kind of steered, this helped us steer clear of this direction. We tried a few other ideas, and here's one we tried, which was sort of a techno look. If you look at the lowercase a, the detail of the tail is removed. Very upright stress, sort of modern looking. And it became pretty clear that we wanted to be much closer to the center of that scale with these fonts. And so we moved sort of to the middle left of the axis and started with this design, which is very upright, very open forms, but not as neutral a design as, say, Helvetica. And from the sketches, I made fonts, and we tried them out in the same screens. And this gave a much more neutral presence, but didn't have the bounciness, but it was still friendly. And we pretty much thought that was the direction to go in, so we tried a whole bunch of different weights to sort of get the idea of whether the boldness, the contrast of the light and the bold were right. And we narrowed it down to these two weights for the regular and the bold of Droid. Now, we only made 2 weights because the italics would be synthesized by Android, that is obliqued. The horrors of oblique type are much less noticeable on a device screen and with a sans serif, so we decided to save space and footprint size to let the engine render the italics. For the serif fonts, we agreed that it had to be very compatible with the sans, obviously, which means that it had to be pretty far away from Times Roman, the most ubiquitous typeface. Times is very delicate, very formal. Looking at the middle example, Century, Century is from a line of types often called the legibility series, and they're sort of your newspaper types are based on these. The very thing that makes newspaper types legible make them work well on devices, and so they're a very good sort of model to start from. Upright stress, sort of monotone, not a lot of not high contrast. The serifs are very sturdy, big X height. All that stuff went into the idea of the Droid serif design. And we agreed that a oblique Roman wouldn't be the best typographic solution, so for a serif design. So I designed so that's the middle, would be an oblique. The bottom is what I designed as a cursive italic, cursive forms of the A and the E and the kind of a long F. All of these things lend contrast to the upright serif design. And that's how the family unfolded. And currently, all the fonts support WGL4, which is about 35 languages. And just to go to Greek real quick, kind of a larger enlargement to think about the slides I showed earlier about the convection Greek. For the serif, you'll note the eta, the last letter on the first, the last Greek letter up there. You'll see a mistake often made with Greek serif types is people will put serifs on the bit that hangs below the baseline and up at the X height. And for the scribal Greeks, the scribal forms of Greek don't have these serifs, and they're actually considered very incorrect. The beta as well, often people will put a serif at the bottom of that descender, and it's just not very well accepted. And for the sans serif, you can see it's still, it's quite fluid, somewhat simplified to go with the sans serif form. And Cyrillic, again, we have the problem of very square forms. I'm adding a lot of curvature to help add to the texture and keep it from looking too upright. And this is sort of how the family looks together. And the goal, of course, was to create fonts that were comfortable for reading, but didn't draw too much attention to themselves. And we may have actually achieved that, as there was a writer for Wired's online edition. He called the fonts googly. So thank you very much. Got time for questions, I imagine. Yeah.
Have you seen the new Xbox recently did a redesign where they used a lot more like iconography and avatars and stuff like that?
The question was, did I see the newest Xbox UI? And no, I haven't. I heard that it was done, and since I'm not a gamer, I'm kind of out of the loop on that. But I saw it as I was. I gave a talk last week in New York, and the same question came up, and they were asking about that. So I definitely have to look at it to see. As far as the blades and such, is that all different, or it's all very?
It's less textual.
Okay. Okay.
Just curious what your opinion would be if it's an improvement seen from your side.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, reading through the screens, they're pretty verbose. I mean, the version that we had in our office, when you go through those blades, there was a lot of information on them. And yes, it's sort of iconography is a great thing, but when you start having to remember what the icon was, what words that were associated with it, becomes a whole nother issue. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, just on that note, like one of my favorite, I think it's an Apple quote or something. one word can convey 1,000 pictures. Like,
Right.
In certain cases, the only right thing to do is to actually write the word and not try to come up with an icon.
Right. One word is worth 1,000 pictures. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
UI fonts always tend to be sans serif most of the time, whereas for immersive reading, books, text, and stuff like that on paper, you always see serif fonts, or almost always. Do you think that's a artifact, the fact that UIs are sans serif is an artifact of very low resolution, and the fact that you don't get good reproduction of the serifs, and that as resolution increases, that you'll actually see serif designs in UI, or do you think there's like a fundamental thing where it really is more like road signs?
Right. So they asked me to repeat the question, so I'll sort of say it again for the sake of the video. So is there a reasoning for text being set in serif styles and UIs being set in sans serif styles? I think a lot of it has to do with legacy. People are used to seeing low resolution type being rendered with sans serif. Certainly they do look better because there's less detail that's probably just going to go away anyway. Screens are getting much better, and you'll see a lot now. Georgia in particular is used quite often now for websites because it's just hinted really well and looks really good. Certainly, I think there's the theory back, going back to publishing days, was the serifs help you give an X height and baseline for your eye to follow. And sans serifs don't have that, and so they require more leading, more space between the lines to help guide your eye left to right. So those reasons for using serifs and sans serifs, reasons for using one or the other, are starting to go away simply because the resolutions are getting so much better. And I think the user interfaces are exactly what you said. It's just people are used to seeing them that way. And again, it's to sort of take advantage of the fact that it's low resolution, so the sans serif is going to hold up better. It's more sturdy. But those reasons are getting less and less. So, yes?
You said Droid is hinted at stuff for small screens.
Yes.
But once it comes out, obviously people will start using it. Like, would it kill your eyes to see it on a web page, much larger? Do you feel like it'll stand out?
No. Okay. So the question is, can the Droid fonts be used at large sizes? I certainly don't think so. What ends up happening with any typeface, when you're designing a type specifically for text, and you use it big, it's going to look too loosely spaced. It might look a little too cumbersome. These are all very design-sensitive things that most people won't gather. But that's why in the old days, when they cut metal types, they cut a size for text that was a little sturdier. But when they got to the big sizes, they made the hairlines more delicate and the details more crisp. So, hey, if we do a Droid for newspaper design and then a Droid for display, we'll be happy to do it. It's not going to kill your eyes to look at, though. Especially the serif. There's a lot of in the serif, the sort of ball terminals have instead of a full ball, they're sort of a crescent shape, and that's because a ball will tend to get very heavy on screen, but it's actually kind of a pretty little finish to the letters. So the letters have a detail that's not going to be very bland and boring if you set it a large size. Yeah, it's sturdy because it's not high contrast, but those little details and refinements are in there. I didn't, just lop them off and make them, squared edges and stuff because there was only a few pixels at the sizes we were working with, because in the future the resolutions get better and it's got to work at those resolutions as well. So, yeah.
So the rendering engine for these fonts are very different, like the open source version and Microsoft's ClearType and these kind of things. Do you think are you happy with the way the open source renderer represents your type when it gets actually displayed?
Okay, so the question is whether I'm happy with the results of the open source renderer versus the Android renderer.
Well, the Android renderer is the open source.
Yeah, well,
versus TrueType.
Well, it is the open source, but you guys have your own thing you're doing now. I mean, it's not just free type. It's sort of a Google free type now. So It's being enhanced and worked on specifically. So looking at proofing, when I was proofing the fonts, looking at them in TrueType, they do look a little bit lighter. And so knowing that, I did scale back on the hairlines and stuff because they're going to be a little darker in the FreeType engine. So on a Windows device or whatnot, it might be a little bit lighter and might not be as good as what you're going to see on an Android phone. So. Okay, yeah, next to you. Two red shirts. I couldn't say the guy in the red shirt because there's two red shirts.
So one of the things that we're dealing with is in web viewing is as we get to, if you start doing sort of floating scaling, then the font size can start being these very interesting non-fixed sizes, like 6.35 pixels and 8.25 pixels. How do you think the font, should be holding up, or, in situations if that was to arise?
Okay, the question is what sort of in-between point sizes, how should it look?
Look at the iPhone, you notice there's, they have gazillion, they're just scaling everything at crazy font sizes. And, yeah.
Okay, so it's a two-part answer. One is the current, the way the SDK is now, and that is the renderer does not have the bytecode interpreter on to look at the hinting that we did because of patent issues and stuff. So the way they behave now is all automatically generated by Mike Reed's renderer. And what's the FreeType engineer? Yeah, Warner. Yeah, he's forgetting names too. Anyway, so essentially the way it's being customized is, the render is being customized is to basically do exactly what you're talking about there. Take care of those sorts of in-between point size issues and make sure the sizes that are your primary sizes look good and that sort of a thing. The hinting that we've done is for every point size. Every pixel size you're going to get when the bytecode interpreter is on to look at hinting is going to be tuned, or has been tuned by our engineers. So it's sort of a, depending on when we're talking about here and whether the bytecode interpreter will be turned on and when, that sort of a thing. So, another question. Yes?
What are you going to use the serif version of Droid for?
I couldn't hear, I'm sorry.
The serif version of Droid, what's going to be used for?
Okay, the serif version of Droid, what are we using it for? For serif content on the web, if someone is looking at a web page that was originally set for Times New Roman and the style sheet says use serif, it will use the Droid serif to render. It theoretically could be used anywhere. It could be used in the UI. There's no reason it shouldn't be. So, yes?
Question about your logo.
Yes?
Did you intend it to look like it says R-A-D?
R-A-E.
R-A-D.
Oh, R-A-D. Rad. That's us. We're rad. Yes.
When I look at it, that's what I see. It's R-A-N-D.
Yeah, it's a figure ground, mess with your mind kind of a thing. No intent other than to be terribly unclever in the few days that we had to launch our company. So,
Once you see it, you can't stop.
That's right. You close your eyes and it's still there. Well, the question I usually get about it is, doesn't it look too much like Adobe's logo? And so, yes?
You also designed for phones to cover the CJK range?
Yes, the CJK, the Droid fallback font. Is it called fallback? I'm not even sure. What's it called in the SDK?
It's called
Droid Sans fallback, okay. So we worked with a partner in China to build specific fonts that pair well with the Droid Sans. So this was a huge undertaking. There are very, very few new Chinese, Japanese, and Korean typefaces being designed out there, but we had this developed. And so essentially, for the ideograph range of CJK, there is So there's 4 traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. Some of those ideographs, well, they share one code point, but all those 4 languages have a preference for a different design. And what we did was specifically design it for simplified Chinese. That was sort of the spec, the brief. But even so, I think it has 46,000 characters in the font. So it's fairly large. Now, if Google or anybody wants to extend so that there's traditional Chinese ideographs in there, we can do that. But it's for the base SDK, that's all we did. So.
The WGS4, is that the base?
WGL4, yeah.
GL4, okay. How many characters is it?
600, thereabouts. There's 2 different ways of defining the WGL4 standard, and one of them includes line draw characters. And the line draw characters are what people use to make ATM screens with these, making these boxes out of letter forms. And not many people do that anymore. Those bars that make the line draw are in the fallback font. So they're accessible, but we didn't see the need to put them in every single font because they're so seldomly used and they take up space. So.
Can you talk about the fallback font, how it works?
Yeah.
Maybe falls in if you get a code point that's not in one of the fonts, it will.
Right. So if you're working, okay, I'll answer the question in the same, or repeat the question in the answer. So if you're typing along Android Serif, and you come along and decide you want the Unicode point that represents the integral symbol for you're doing some math formula, it's not in Droid Sans, but it is in the fallback font. So it will call up from the fallback font rather than give you an empty box. So you can it automatically accesses this fallback font as for characters that are unusual or not typical text stream characters. Very good question. I'm glad I brought him. He's my colleague, Josh Hadley. He's in San Jose, so I thought I'd drag him along. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Great questions, and great job on Android.